The reason that we made the loudness penalty website was so that anybody can make that decision for themselves. I'm saying if you're going to do this, then do it with your ears open. So in a nutshell, theloudnesspenalty.com, you can go there, you can drag a file onto the box in the middle of the website, and it will be measured. And the website will tell you how much that song will be turned down, if it's going to be turned down by YouTube and Spotify and Tidal and all the others.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. This episode is sponsored by SonarWorks, helping you get the most out of your mixes by correcting the sound of the speakers and headphones in your studio so you get your mix right the first time. Are you sick of doing multiple mixes and still you can't get the low end right? How would it feel to have badass bass the first time? Get a 21-day free trial at sonarworks.com. Are you ready to rock the perfect mix? This episode is sponsored by OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is actually a repeat guest. I want to welcome back Ian Shepherd from Mastering Media Ltd and Production Advice UK. He joined us previously on episode 8, way back in the beginning, and we're very psyched to have him here again. Ian has mastered thousands of CDs, DVDs, and Blu-rays for all of the major record labels, TV stations, and independents, including several number one singles and award-winning albums. Some of Ian's credits include Keane, Tricky, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, Deep Purple, The Orb, Culture Club, New Order, King Crimson, I like that one a lot, amongst many others. Ian also has a blog, as I was mentioning, productionadvice.co.uk, where he teaches you how to master your own music with plugins in your DAW, among many other things. You may be aware also that the loudness wars have caused music to get louder and louder since digital music was introduced in the 1980s. But you may not know that music streaming sites have finally taken us out of the loudness wars by automatically adjusting levels of all songs on playback to hit a matched listening level from song to song. This means that louder songs today can actually get penalized and turned down by sites like Spotify and YouTube. So you really want to get your levels just right so that they hit the sweet spot and sound great when streaming. Ian takes the loudness wars seriously. And in fact, he created hashtag Dynamic Range Day to help raise awareness around the world about the importance of finding the loudness sweet spot for your music. He also created some amazing tools like Perception and Dynameter to help you check your loudness levels in real time when mixing or mastering. And today we're going to talk about Ian's newest free website tool called loudnesspenalty.com that lets you check your actual loudness for each music streaming site to make sure that your mix and your song or master will play back at the correct levels and keep you out of the loudness penalty box. So please welcome Ian Shepherd to Recording Studio Rockstars. Ian, my friend, are you ready to rock yet again?
I most certainly am.
Oh, dude, that's so great, because I remember the first time you were on here, we sort of joked around about how, rocking was a bit of an American thing, and you were a little uncertain whether you were feeling confident about but being ready to rock. But this time, clearly, you own it.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Awesome, dude. Well, give us a brief introduction. I mean, we already have an episode of you talking about your past in recording and everything. But I'm psyched to have you back. And I wonder if you could just introduce yourself briefly to the rock stars again, and then we'll just jump right into our topic of the day.
Sure. I mean, you did a great job already. I kind of feel like maybe I could just, we could wrap it up here and I could go home. No, so I've been a mastering engineer for 20 years plus. And in 2008 or 9, I started my first blog and kind of joined Twitter and all that kind of thing. And the online stuff has just been growing since then. I've got a podcast these days called The Mastering Show.
Great
which
show,
is,
too.
Oh, thank you. So is yours.
Thank you.
All about mastering, as the title suggests. And people love the website. There's a YouTube channel where I occasionally put videos. I need to do more of that, I think. The kind of the newest thing and the thing that I'm really excited about is the plugins that I have. I mean, your introduction gave the impression that I was solely responsible for this stuff. It's very much a partnership between myself and another Ian Kerr from Meter Plugs. And together we've developed, he already had a couple of, he has a loudness meter and the K meter that uses Bob Katz's idea of the K system for kind of figuring loudness out. And together we kind of came up with Perception, which helps you hear the effects of loudness or dynamics on your music really, really clearly, and Dynameter, which is a visual aid to help you get the perfect balance. And now we have Loudness Penalty, which we can talk about. Yeah.
So Ian is a great guy, yes, and thank you for reminding us to be aware of his participation in all this, his contributions. The K meter is another great plugin, which I didn't mention, but that is one that I'm using regularly in my mixing. And I love it. It's just it's so nice to be able to switch to a meter setting that really makes you feel confident that you're hitting the right kind of ballpark when you're mixing. And it was also, when you talk about mastering for 20 years, I do remember, I think it was Bob Katz that I heard do a presentation once where he showed the rising volumes from the introduction of CDs over a couple of decades. And so I wondered if you wanted to talk about and give sort of an introduction to what the loudness wars are and what, this history of music getting louder and louder in the digital world, just so the rock stars have a better understanding of the context.
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting because, you're right in saying that the current loudness war kind of started, not so much when digital music started coming out, but when digital processing started being used. So I trained as a mastering engineer in 1994, and back then, my studio, I had 20-bit A to D conversion, and I had 24-bit processing, and that was a big deal back then. It was like there were hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment in my studio to enable me to do that, and that was back in the days when seeing the DDD on the back of a CD, meaning it was digitally recorded and mixed and mastered, was actually a bonus and a kind of a selling point, which is funny these days when everybody is all about the analog again. Yeah. But so back then, I guess maybe 2 or 3 years after I started, the TC Electronic released the first thing they did was called the M5000, which was a digital signal processing box that included really high quality limiting and really high quality multiband compression. And then a couple of years after that, they came out with the Finalizer, which is probably the one that most people have heard of, which was one of the first kind of prosumer pieces of digital gear for making stuff really loud.
I totally remember the Finalizer. One of the first mastering engineers I worked with, he started out with just a little, sort of like a loft studio upstairs in his house, with just a Finalizer. And that thing really did magic back then,
Yeah, it gets bad press because people would, it included presets, and presets, you can't really pull out a preset and just plug it onto any piece of music, but that doesn't mean that the tool is bad, right? They wanted to help people get started, just as people do these days with plugins. And the other thing is people used it to make stuff really, really loud, and that was the kind of the beginning of that. What I was going to say was that was the kind of the beginning of the current digital loudness war, if you like. But it's happened before. It was happening back in the days of Motown and the Beatles. I mean, in fact, the reason that Abbey Road got hold of their first set of, I was going to say Fairlight. That's not the, I don't mean Fairlight. That's a sampler.
Oh yeah, right.
What's the
the
Fairchild's? Fairchild.
The Fairchild 670s.
Fairchild compressor. Yeah. They got hold of those specifically to try and emulate the really loud compressed sound that Motown was achieving on their vinyl. Because one of the interesting things about vinyl, people think that you can't cut really hot vinyl, which is true. There's a risk that you burn out the cutting head if you push too much level onto it. But in fact, in terms of the record, playing the record, the risk is that if you have too much dynamic bass in there, you can actually cause the needle to skip. So back then it was about compressing the bass more in order to be able to put more level onto the vinyl without causing those kind of problems and get louder records that way. So there was already a loudness war. And early on in my career, I remastered a huge number of records from the Pi recording studios here in the UK. And I don't know whether you've heard it. There's an artist called Petula Clark back in the 60s, who and some of the stuff that came off there was insanely loud and distorted. I mean, I maybe not to modern standards, but there really was a loudness war happening then. What happened then was it backed off, and by the time I started buying records in the 80s, I think we really were in this sweet spot where there's this great balance between, the vinyl sounded great, the levels were great, but it wasn't absurd.
That's wild. That's so fascinating. I'd actually never heard that there was also sort of this journey of loudness exploration during vinyl records. I was aware of it through the digital age, but not prior to that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of inevitable. That's the problem, because the thing that's driving this back then and now is the fact that if I play anybody 2 files, and I've actually done this as a demonstration in a room with 100 people just playing it through speakers. If you play them 2 files that are otherwise completely identical, but one of them is even as little as half a dB, but certainly a dB louder, and then you ask them which one they prefer, the majority of people tend to go with the louder version. Even though they probably couldn't tell you that was why they picked it. And it's because when you have a slightly louder sound, our ears, or our brains, I should say, pick out more of the bass and the treble from that sound. So it's not a kind of a real effect. It's nothing to do with the recording. It's nothing to do with the sound in the air. It's how we hear it. And nobody knows quite why, but I always make the joke that it could be an evolutionary process where our brains, or evolution has selected us to pay more attention to the saber-toothed tiger that's breathing down our neck than the one that's kind of 100 yards over there looking at a herd of gazelles. Right. Stuff that is dangerous or interesting is likely to be closer, is likely to be louder, so maybe we pay more attention to it. And that basically is it. So it used to be a trick. When I first started out as a mastering engineer, there were no recordable CDs then, and even when they came in, they cost £15 each. So people couldn't, even if they brought their master in on a digital audio tape, on a DAT tape, they couldn't do a one-to-one comparison between their source and the mastered files. So even if you had a perfect recording as a mastering engineer, you could choose to just turn it up a little bit. And then when they took it away to do their comparison, it would sound that little bit better to them, right? Now, of course, I would never do that, being a completely ethical and thoroughly English mastering engineer. But actually, that's not true. I did do it occasionally. A lot of the time, the levels were just a little bit low on the DATs anyway, right? And one of the things about mastering is you're making the songs more consistent from track to track. And then the other thing is you want to get it into the sweet spot. So you would use a little bit of gentle processing and all the rest of it to achieve those results. And that almost always involves making it louder. Even now, every day when I master records, I make them often louder. That's not the problem. The problem is that eventually you run out of headroom, right? You run out of space.
Right.
There's digital formats, especially. Back in the analog days, it was, kind of blowing the desk or just utterly saturating the tape, or burning out the cutting head on the lathe. These days, you have this digital ceiling, 0 dBFS, that we see at the top of the meters in all of our software.
And that's our ceiling. We can't go beyond that, or else we get into clipping and distortion.
Exactly. So you can turn things up, and they're going to sound slightly better every time, until you hit that ceiling. And at that point, you then have to make some compromises, right? You have to start affecting the music to achieve any extra loudness. And that's, right. I mean, even that's not the problem. Your average mix probably has somewhere between 14 and 16 dBs difference between the loudness level and 0 dB full scale. Mm-hmm. So you've probably got 14 to 16 dBs of headroom there to play with. You can, if you do it carefully in mastering, you can reduce that to as little as 10 or even 8 dBs. And still have it sound fantastic. And that's kind of where we were in the, I don't want to say the early 80s, maybe the late 80s, when we hit that sweet spot where everything was, as far as I'm concerned, really working well.
Well, that's fascinating. So when I recall what I saw, I think it was Bob Katz presenting, he showed this upward curve of records getting louder over 20 years or something like that. And they had gotten literally 20 decibels louder than where they started. And so, it's remarkable because it's just this, like you say, it's this progression toward the ceiling of what a digital playback system can actually, hold for information and reproduce for you. And eventually it just got to be ridiculous. I mean, we don't have to go through the whole history of it, but, as we know, it kind of hit this point of no return when the Metallica album came out and was just people began to notice that it was maybe louder than it needed to be, and we started backing off. But that kind of brings us to where things are at now. Maybe you can introduce us to what's going on with online streaming and how that became a solution and why that is so important as sort of the end of the loudness wars.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a solution yet, but it has the potential to. It's not even a solution. I mean, the reason it's happening has nothing to do with the loudness wars. In fact, online streaming companies, well, to the best of my knowledge, don't really care about the loudness wars. I mean, actually, probably the engineers who work there do. Whenever we talk to anybody, we find that they care passionately about the way the music sounds, and there is, as opposed to just making stuff ridiculously loud for the sake of it, as we are. Yeah. But just, they're running businesses, right? Their job is to make their users happy. That is why they've introduced this change. What they found is that the number one source of complaints from users is sudden changes in loudness. So, I mean, we've all had it. You have your iPod on shuffle, you're listening in the car, and either the song that you play next or that comes up next is way quieter, and you have to reach and crank up the level so that you can hear what's going on, or the next song that comes on is way louder than the thing you were just listening to, and it blasts out, and you're worried you're going to be damaging your speakers or your ears or whatever. That's really frustrating when it happens. So, and that causes complaints everywhere. Radio, TV, you name it. People really hate it. And that's what the streaming companies want to fix or improve.
I understand it. I mean, it's one of the things that I hate. In fact, even as a podcast listener, it's one of the reasons why, for me personally, I try and set the bar for the mixes for this podcast to be something that you can just set your car stereo or your headphones or whatever you're listening to it on. Actually, my reference for this has always been, I want to be able to play back the podcast through the iPhone speaker and set it on a ledge and take a shower and still hear most clearly, as clearly as I can, what's going on in the interview. But it's that ability to sort of not miss out on any of the words or not have to feel like you turn it up and then have to turn it back down and all that.
Exactly. And it's you want to find the sweet spot, right? Because I mean, the interesting thing is that even with speech, when you push it too far, it actually can get harder to pick out what people are saying, because our ears are very, we're evolved to listen to other people speaking. That's how you manage to hear what people are saying if they're talking to you in a noisy environment. And if you change that signal too much, then it gets harder again. But yes, there's definitely if it's too quiet and not consistent enough, it's a problem. And if it's too loud and distorted and squashed, then it's a problem.
So the streaming sites created a scenario wherein they will adjust levels between songs. So it's as if you had, your favorite DJ standing by your stereo and bringing the volume up and down for every song to make sure that everything plays back at a nice even level for you, right?
That's the goal. I'm not sure that I would say that it's working perfectly yet. But yeah, that's definitely what they're trying to do. So they each, in their own way, measure the loudness of, or attempt to measure the loudness of the music. And I mean, this is where it all starts to get a bit complicated because they all do slightly different things. But the one thing you can guarantee is they will turn super loud stuff down. So, I mean, you mentioned Metallica and the Death Magnetic album that kind of caused a big flurry in the press back in, I guess, 2008, maybe it was. If you compare that with one of their other most famous albums, the Black Album, I think there's it's either 8 or 10 dBs difference in loudness between those albums. So,
wow.
But Metallica have never been a quiet band. But Death Magnetic was 10 dBs, let's say, louder than the Black Album. But if you install Spotify for the first time on your phone or your PC and choose to listen to those two songs or two songs from those albums back to back, you will not hear a huge difference. You won't hear 8 to 10 dBs difference in loudness. They will sound more or less consistent because the really loud one has been turned down.
By Spotify.
Actually by the player. Not they don't alter the files on their servers. It's just so you can disable it if you go into Spotify's preferences. But yeah, there's no extra processing. It's just a volume control. So it's no different than if they had left. Well, it is different than if they'd left it and you'd gone, oh hell, that's too loud, and turned it down, right? Because it's better because you didn't have to do that. But it would sound identical.
So very cool.
And that's it in a nutshell.
And just a reminder that, of course, like the majority of people who are listening to the music that we make and the records we make, they're just going to install Spotify and not even know that there's a switch in there to change it. They're going to be happy that it works and all their music plays back at a consistent level. And so most people are going to experience the online streaming players adjusting the level for you to bring things that are too loud back down to a consistent level.
Exactly. It's on. Well, it's permanently switched on in YouTube. You can't disable it. It's permanently switched on in Pandora. You can't change it there. It's on by default in Spotify. It's on by default in Tidal on the mobile app. It's not out on the desktop app yet, but it's coming. And it's not on. The only one that it's not on by default in is iTunes yet. Okay. But my prediction is that will happen too in the future. I don't know why I say the near future, but it's pretty much an inevitability because it makes a better listening experience. You're right. You know, some people complain about it. Some people say they want to hear things exactly as they originally were. But often I think that's because of a misunderstanding. Because, I mean, you know, one objection you could have to this is, well, it's going to change the loudness of songs within an album. But actually, on iTunes, on Tidal, on Spotify, if you play an album, the songs stay the right relationship to each other. Typically, this stuff only happens in shuffle.
Right.
So basically, it's a good thing. And just to kind of pull it back to the original topic, even though that's not why they did it, it also means that the loudness war basically has no influence, right? You know, all of the effort that went into making Death Magnetic 10 dBs louder than the Black Album might as well never have happened, because when people hear it, they come back at a similar loudness. So what it means is, because the problem with the loudness war, you know, I don't have a problem with loud music. I love loud music. And I don't have a problem with people wanting to make their music loud. It's their music. They should be free to do that if that's their choice. The problem I have with it is where people seem to feel that it's somehow a requirement. I mean, I know from my own experience and from talking to other engineers that if you submit a song to an A&R rep or to a record company, to an agent, whoever, there is a significant risk that if it doesn't sound as loud as the last thing they heard, they're not going to be impressed by it.
Right. Well,
the
in
sad
that case,
thing about that is that it doesn't have any influence. It doesn't connect at all to what people hear in the real world, right? Because the other thing that people say is, well, who cares about streaming? But actually, what's the I think it's only 17% of the revenue in the music business came from physical copies in 2017.
Yeah, I'm not buying
so
it.
that's going to be.
I'm not buying an argument that who cares about streaming? Streaming, I care about streaming. It's how I listen to music. I think it's how everybody listens to music. My daughter has certainly never put in a CD or popped in a cassette or even like put on a vinyl record to listen back. So I think streaming is relevant. I think that what we're describing is the new norm for your music listening experience, is hearing online streaming with this this loudness matching feature built in. So translation to those of us who are making and mixing and mastering music, Ian, is that if we mix our music and try and make it hot, we can actually mix it, particularly master it, to be hotter than it needs to be, so that it's going to be turned down when it gets played back on the streaming sites, right?
Yeah, that's a major risk, especially if you compare it with kind of big name releases on CDs from the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, I do think the loudness war probably peaked around about I don't know, 2004, 2006 maybe. I feel like things have calmed down a bit since then, but there's still some really, really loud stuff, and in some quite weird genres. You hear it in country music and now, and all kinds of places where it's just like, I don't understand why country music needs to be screamingly loud.
Right.
I don't understand why somebody would want to listen to it good and loud. But
probably because you're driving around in a
attention.
pickup truck and the windows are down and the wind's screaming in your windows. I don't know.
Of course. so you crank it up, right?
So you just
turn up. It doesn't have to be loud coming out. Anyway, that's a different discussion maybe. But
so there's a sweet spot, really. Let's keep helping define it and understand it. So if you push your mix louder than the sweet spot for the streaming platforms, then all the streaming platforms are going to turn your mix back down, which also means that those peaks in your mix, that where the kicks and snares are hitting and really like punching and pushing transients through, and the stuff that really can make your mix sound great. Also, I believe the low end, can if you're pushing the low end to be as loud as possible, it can also take some of the air and transparency out of your low end, and the ability for your bass and your kick to really breathe and have some life in a mix. It can turn all that back down, which means that really we want to be creating mixes and masters that are getting as close as we can to what these online platforms consider to be the sweet spot. Now, they're all a little different, right? And I'll let you go into that in just a moment. But I think we can still consider that there's generally a little bit of a sweet spot between them. And we might want to really try and make that our target, so that our mix doesn't get turned up or down much at all, and that our transients still punch through, so that when we play this stuff back, it really feels as punchy as we want it to.
Yeah, exactly. It's not necessarily a problem that loud stuff gets turned down if it still sounds fantastic. Mm-hmm. The problem is that in my experience, well, the great thing is that the sweet spot, that the kind of you're right, within 2 or 3 dBs, there's a pretty consistent level from all of these services. And the really good news is that they've chosen that sweet spot really well, I think, because it corresponds very closely with what I consider to be the ideal balance of loudness and dynamics over music history, right? So the best sounding stuff that's coming out today, the best sounding stuff from the 80s, from the 70s, even from, Abbey Road by the Beatles was remastered recently. I don't think they made it any louder than it was when it was originally released.
Fascinating.
But it sits right in that zone. And I mean, just, kind of slightly off topic, it's that zone also corresponds with what I personally have chosen to do with my own mastering. So, as a mastering engineer, I started in '94, watched the loudness wars kind of progress, and somewhere around the year 2000. I mean, if Death Magnetic was kind of the peak, the kind of the bit where it really started getting people's attention was around about the year 2000, when Oasis released "What's the Story, Morning Glory." Definitely the second Oasis album. Yeah, What's the Story? or Californication by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Those were a couple of the first albums that were really, really loud, that kind of, I remember mastering engineers talking about and debating about online, kind of saying, people saying this is too much, this has gone too far, and getting concerned about this issue.
So it's interesting, the concept of, debating whether the mastering levels have gone too far or whether it's an issue. I mean, in the end, I think for most of us, we just are responding to the way it sounds. We know if we like it or if we don't like it. And one of the things that really was an eye-opener or an ear-opener for me was beginning to understand that I could have a mix that sounds really great the way I like it, but it's a little bit quieter than the next version where I limit it and I start pushing it and I make it a lot hotter. So when I compare both those files side by side, I might have traditionally thought that the one that is louder sounds better to me because it is louder, But what's going to happen is if I was to upload both of those to online streaming as a final product and it was going to play back as, for the final listening experience, the louder one would get turned down. And then side by side comparison, the one that was originally printed at the sweet spot for a level may sound better, is likely to sound actually better than the one that I had turned up and sort of like lost some of my punch and transients and everything that then got turned down. Do you feel like that's an accurate description of what happens when you sort of push your mixes too loud and you end up kind of in the loudness penalty box for online streaming?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's, the level that they've chosen, like I say, fits in with all of those great sounding records over history. So if you're in the same kind of region, chances are your stuff is going to sound great as well. But lots of mainstream releases over the last 4 or 5 years have been 4, 5, 6 dBs louder than that. So they're getting turned down by 4, 5, or 6 dBs. And in my experience, to me, they never sound as good. I haven't yet heard a comparison between something that was mastered in that sweet spot and something that was just pushed harder. Sometimes they don't sound that much worse. Sometimes they sound horrendous in comparison. They're pumping, there's distortion, there's clipping, all the rest of it. And you're right. For me, the stuff that's in that sweet spot has more life, it has more space, it has more depth, it has more impact. It catches your ear, it jumps out at you in comparison to the ones that have been pushed really hard and then turned back down. But that's an individual decision, right? That's my opinion. There are mastering engineers who think that even the levels that I'm suggesting are too loud and things should be mastered with even more dynamics. And there are mastering engineers who go, no, you're just being too conservative, and 2 or 3 dBs louder is fine as well. The reason that we made the loudness penalty website was so that anybody can make that decision for themselves, right? And I think that's cool. That's my point of view. It's not like I'm saying to people, don't do this. I'm saying if you're going to do this, then do it with your ears open, right?
Yeah.
Do it with the knowledge of make that comparison. If I so in a nutshell, the loudness penalty website, loudnesspenalty.com, you can go there, you can drag a file onto the box in the middle of the website, and it will be measured. And the website will tell you how much that song will be turned down, if it's going to be turned down by YouTube and Spotify and Tidal and all the others.
Mm-hmm. And not only that, it'll actually
just
play it back for you.
It's not going to be uploaded as part of that process. All of that processing, all of that calculation happens in the browser.
Fascinating.
Cool. It's completely safe. It's completely secure. Lots of people are kind of like, I don't want to upload my music somewhere. It doesn't get uploaded. It just,
right.
Everything happens on your computer. So it's exactly as secure as it was when it was a file on your hard drive.
So cool.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Ian has done an amazing job getting the code to work, and he recently worked an update that kind of pretty much doubled the speed, and it works on mobile phones. It's amazing. Let's imagine you tried that and it said that your song was going to be turned down by 6 dBs on YouTube. Some people would say, who cares? It's still going to sound as loud as everything else, because that's the point, is to get consistent loudness. I liked it before I knew that it was going to be turned down by 6 dBs. Why should I care that it's being turned down by 6 dBs now? And I can understand that. But for me, I just feel like I want to at least be curious. I want to at least check. I kind of go, okay, so there's kind of 6 dBs of wasted peak headroom in that file. How would it, let me just try how it would sound if I just, eased everything back, gave it a little bit more room to breathe, a little bit less limiting, a little bit less clipping or saturation, a little bit less compression, whatever it is, just give it a bit more space. And the great thing about the loudness penalty site is you can do that comparison. You can have two tabs open in your browser. You can drop the loud version, exactly what you were talking about, where you have your mix that you're already happy with, and then the limited version that you've pushed a bit harder. You put one of those in one tab of the browser, you put one of them in the other, because then you can preview. You can just press play and you can hear them at the loudness that they're going to be played on YouTube or Spotify or wherever. And you can flick between them and compare them. And you mentioned your iPhone test. Well, you know all about this, Lidge. You don't have to be humble. This feature exists partly because you pushed me so hard to get it working, and I then pushed Ian.
Well, it's so great. So let me say some of this back to you too. And Rockstars, I want to make sure you really understand how this is useful to you. So it's much more than just a measurement tool. As Ian's saying, it will actually, the website, you can go take your mix, drop it on there. Like Ian says, it doesn't upload your music to the website. All it does is analyze it and come up with, it adjusts the player in the browser to mimic what you would experience on YouTube or Spotify or Tidal or Pandora or iTunes. And I can only guess that you guys will probably just be adding more, online players in the future if you want to. But basically, it hits all the major online player levels, and it will, you can click on YouTube and it will actually play your mix back at that YouTube volume. So rather than have to upload your mix to YouTube and, try and keep some link private and then listen to it and see how it's sounding, you can just do this immediately using loudnesspenalty.com. And as Ian's suggesting, you could have two tabs open, so you can do a loud version of your mix. You can do a quieter, like you can back off some of the stuff. I mean, seriously, how many times have you ever tracked a record, really kind of loved what was happening, done a rough mix, then come back later to mix it, and then felt like, oh, of course, you've got to do a bunch of stuff to it. And then you mix it, and then you listen to your rough mix and your final mix is sort of, somehow with all the compression and saturation and everything else, ended up a little bit lifeless compared to the rough mix. That this gives you an opportunity to do different versions of how loud you want your mix to be, upload them, and then you just listen. You just click the YouTube thing and you listen and you choose the one that sounds better to you, and it will immediately tell you sort of what your target level is for these online streaming. It's just a super cool thing. And it's free, and it's just waiting there for you to go use it at loudnesspenalty.com. So jump in, Ian, take over.
No, I mean, exactly. You said it. And, that's the thing. If the version that's being turned down by 6 dBs sounds best to you, then that's the version you should go for. To me, that hardly ever happens. Personally, with the loudest stuff, I'm comfortable with the kind of it being turned down by a couple of dBs on YouTube. If it's a kind of really aggressive genre and it's just full tilt the whole way through. But yeah, everybody can make up their own mind and get the best results. Find the sweet spot that you feel is right for your music. So that's the goal of the site, and that's what it helps people do. And the feedback we've had so far, it's been online for a couple of months now. We've been getting great feedback from people. People love it. So we're really pleased with the whole thing.
Super cool. Well, Rockstars, we're going to take a break for just a moment, and we'll come right back in to talk more about loudnesspenalty.com and also about some of these other wonderful tools that Ian has developed with Ian and Ian to help you guys make sure that your mixes are sounding as best they possibly can at the final playback. And a reminder that you'll find links to what we're talking about directly in the show notes. I'll have a link, of course, to loudnesspenalty.com. Just click through on your mobile device and you can see it right in the show notes. Or go to rsrockstars.com and search for Ian, and it'll take you right to the blog post and you can see it there. So we'll see you guys in just a minute for the jam session. You've already invested in your studio speakers, headphones, and treatment of the room, and you're passionate about creating great music, but your mixes don't seem to translate to the rest of the world. The reason is that your speakers and headphones are not telling you the whole story. The frequency response of your studio has huge peaks and valleys all throughout the low end that are completely screwing up your perspective. You may be doing your best to hit the bullseye with your mix, but your room makes the target of a perfect mix impossible to find. Wouldn't it feel great if there was a simple tool that could fix all that for you and help you get your mixes right the first time? Introducing SonarWorks Reference 4, the affordable solution to correcting your speakers and headphones in your studio. Built for Windows and Mac, SonarWorks helps you position your speakers, correct your control room imperfections, and get $1 million sound on a home studio budget. Get a 21-day free trial at sonarworks.com and start your journey toward the perfect mix. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your existing Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD drive, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now. We're going to jump into the second half in the jam session. My guest today is Ian Shepherd, joining us from Production Advice UK and also from LOUDNESSpenalty.com. We're going to talk about more about, getting your mixes to hit the sweet spot as far as loudness goes so that your music really plays back, sounding as good as it can and as you hoped it would play back on all the streaming sites. Ian, are you ready to jam?
I am ready to jam.
All right, cool, man. So diving back in, I wanted to share a little bit of a case study for the Rockstars from my experience. Without getting into too many specifics, I was making a mix and a master of a song, and I thought that I had a really kind of a pretty good thing going. I was struggling with a couple of details, but mostly thought I was in the ballpark for where it should be going on a final production of a jazz song. And then when I uploaded it to LOUDNESSpenalty.com, all of a sudden I see that it's like everything's turning it down. It was like 4.5 dB on YouTube, 6 dB turned down on Spotify, 4.5 on Tidal, 5.5 on Pandora, and 5 down on iTunes. And then you took the same file that I was working on and tweaked it differently and adjusted the loudness differently, left a little more headroom and stuff, and sent it back to me, and I uploaded that one. Now it was only getting, it actually was getting turned down just a little bit, but it was only coming down 1.3 on YouTube and, a little bit on Spotify and Tidal and Pandora and iTunes. And when I finally was able to go from tab to tab, and Rockstars, I'm going to tell you how cool this was. Ian actually went through some back and forth with me trying to help. I was trying to give him feedback and help, just come up with ideas for how this might be useful on my end. And Ian actually created this so that I could do it, which you can now too, from an iPhone. Literally, I was flipping between browser pages on an iPhone, playing back the music in my car, in the car stereo, where I sort of, hate it or love it, still consider that to be sort of a final call on whether I'm getting my music right. And it was remarkable. The one that hit the sweet spot that you had sent back to me sounded better, and it sounded closer to my original intention of the way I wanted it to sound than the one that I had uploaded that sounded much louder if you if you just played the two wave files back to back. So I wondered if you wanted to, if you had any comments on that. And then also another question I wanted to ask relative to that was just, why are there all these different numbers on the different sites?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I love that example. and that's the kind of example we keep hearing more and more about, because it's a perfect example of how the site can be useful. Because one of the objections people come up with is they go, well, why are you calling it loudness penalty? I mean, it's just the streaming sites are evening out the loudness. What's the penalty about it? Okay, it's been turned down, but who cares? It's just a level adjustment. If it sounds great to me, what's the problem? And that example you mentioned was the perfect example where your original file had been pushed so hard that, and I should say it hadn't been pushed super hard, right? But to the point where there was stuff about it that you didn't like. And the great thing about comparing it when you were using loudness penalty or with the loudness matched is that the reasons for that jump out at you. Yeah, I remember you saying that you felt like, there was something crunchy in the piano. And I think the drums weren't working quite right for you.
Well, there's another thought from my memory of it. So for me, a big determining factor about how loud my final mix and master is whether I'm able to turn it up in the car and whether the low end sort of feels like it can breathe, or whether it feels like it's sort of imploding on itself and just blowing up the stereo. And now that I'm thinking about it, it's like if you take two side-by-side wave files and you master one to be louder, you're sort of bringing up the perceived loudness on the one that's louder, and you're doing things like sort of bringing up the low end. You're condensing all the low end and all that energy and sort of pressing it together on the louder version. But then when they played back in loudnesspenalty.com and the louder version was turned back down, now it's like the low ends are a little more matched. Well, they're not matched, but they're closer in level for playback. But when I then want to go turn my stereo up to just sort of like, to just pump up the volume on playback, the one that wasn't as loud originally, it's like it still had that breathing room for the low end and like had more air. But the one that was a little bit more squashed, as I turn up the stereo, it just sounds like it sounds too compressed or too condensed,
Exactly. And that's, I mean, when we were talking about this originally, talking about pushing the loudness up and up against that 0 dB full scale ceiling, you've basically just got less space to work with, right? It's like, I don't know, it's like somebody bouncing on a trampoline, right? If they got a 15-foot ceiling above them, they can bounce as high as they like. But if you lift that trampoline up and up and up and up, eventually they're going to bang their head.
Right, exactly.
And if they don't bang their head, they're going to have to kind of fold up into a ball or curl up. They're going to have to compress themselves, right? They're going to have to reduce the space that they take up in order to fit into what's left. And the same is true of the music. And if you go too far with that, it has all of those effects that you didn't like. I mean, there's another interesting thing just to do with Bluetooth. We haven't kind of tested this, but I have this little theory that if the Bluetooth connection from your iPhone to the stereo was lossless, so it was a perfect copy of the audio, then whatever you're hearing is basically down to the way you hear it in your car stereo. But my guess is that actually that file was probably being converted to an MP3 to keep the data rate down when it was passed from the iPhone to your stereo.
Yeah.
And the risk there is that if you've got something super loud, I mean, this is something that lots of people don't realize. Stuff that is super loud doesn't compress down to MP3 or AAC or any of these streaming codecs as well. You actually can get extra clipping caused in the encoding process because that process, the files get reduced in size 90%. So if you've got like a 100 megabyte file, it gets squashed down to 10 meg, right? So, and the calculations that go on in the computer in order to achieve that, they do some really radical processing on the file. I mean, it's kind of a miracle that they come out sounding as good as they do.
Right.
But yeah, if the loudness is crushed up there on the input to that process, then you can get extra distortion coming in on the output. So that might also have been a factor in what you were hearing that you didn't like in that situation. And I would love to actually test that and see if we can prove whether that's the case or not.
Well, maybe we'll get to do that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's another great reason to find the sweet spot for the music and not push it too far, because basically the further you go beyond that, the more risk there is of that kind of problem happening. One quick clarification I can make incidentally is that loudness penalty isn't doing that. When you all we do is preview the volume changes. There are some tools out there that will also preview the effect of the codecs used by all of the different sites. So when you hear stuff on loudness penalty, it's just your raw files with the loudness changed.
Right.
But for me, that's a much more significant factor, usually, with the possible exception of this whole business about, the super loud stuff getting even more clipped.
Well, that's cool. Another thing I did notice on the loudnesspenalty.com was that sometimes you would just get like 2 dashes. So the 2 questions. One is, why all the difference in numbers between them? And 2 is, what does it mean if you get 2 dashes when you upload your music?
Right. So the reason the numbers are different is that all of the streaming services calculate loudness in slightly different ways and have slightly different playback levels. So, we were talking about, you mentioned earlier, there's generally a consistent level. Overall, if you're using a loudness meter, an LUFS meter, that becoming more and more popular these days, give or take, most of the streaming sites are around about -14 LUFS for the overall loudness.
Okay,
YouTube is a little bit loud. Yeah, YouTube is a little bit louder. iTunes is a little bit quieter, but Spotify and Tidal are pretty much bang on -14. But they are all slightly different. So that's one reason, is just they're using different playback levels. So YouTube uses a slightly higher replay level, so you will get slightly less loudness penalty almost always on YouTube than the other sites, right? Because they're playing back at a slightly higher level, so they don't have to turn it down quite as far to achieve the consistency. But there are other differences. One is that they use different methods. So we know that Spotify uses replay gain, which has been around for a long time and that lots of people know about. It's one method of calculating loudness. We know that Tidal uses LUFS, these new loudness units, to calculate their loudness. But they all do it slightly differently. And then they also have slightly different rules. So one of the most important ones is that YouTube and Tidal don't turn quiet songs up. Okay. So all of these streaming services will turn loud stuff down, but YouTube and Tidal don't turn quiet stuff up. Spotify does, Pandora does, iTunes does. iTunes and Pandora will try to avoid causing clipping by that process. So if they want to turn it up further than they could when they're causing clipping, they won't. So that's a factor that the site bears in mind. Spotify will turn stuff up, but they will actually add a limiter. That's something that, so if you have quieter music that is more dynamic, and Spotify decide that they want to turn it up to make it more consistent, then your song could actually get some extra limiting that you didn't intend. So you asked what the 2 dashes mean. That happens when the streaming service isn't going to change the loudness at all. So you most often see that on YouTube or Tidal, right? Because they don't turn stuff up. So
maybe that's because YouTube, originally it's a video playback site, and film. I feel like film, has a lot more dynamic range in quiet parts of some, video or movie you're watching, and quiet voices and loud stuff. So maybe by default, it was meant to leave a lot of room for things to remain quiet if they need to.
That's possible. Yeah. I don't know the exact reasoning behind it. I mean, another reason, and I think the reason that Tidal don't do it, is because you have this problem, right? If you have something, so Tidal, it's simple because it's LUFS. So their level is -14. They base it on the loudest song on the album. So if you upload an album, they'll measure all the songs. They'll find the loudest song. They will turn that down to -14 if necessary. They'll turn all the other songs down by the same amount, so to keep the song by song loudness intact. And that's all they do. If you had something where the loudest song was at -16 and they decided to turn it up, there is this risk that it might cause clipping, or that they would have to use a limiter. And that's something that gets people who care about music quality really upset, right? Because both of those things, limiting that you didn't choose to add to your music or clipping is not good. And Tidal's one of their big selling points, right, is lossless audio streaming and the highest possible quality. Yeah. So that's another reason that they didn't do it. That might have figured into YouTube's reasoning as well. So yeah, they all have different reasons, different ways of doing things. And that's one of the reasons that we made the site. I mean, I've been talking on my blog about kind of been keeping tabs on what the different streaming services have been doing. And like one of my most popular posts ever was when I noticed that, or actually, to be fair, some of my readers pointed out to me that Spotify had reduced their level. So Spotify used to have a higher playback loudness level than YouTube. And a couple of years ago, they reduced it to be similar to YouTube, actually slightly quieter. That was a huge deal, and I pointed out that they had reduced it to roughly -14, which is kind of similar to where Tidal is at. But it's not exactly -14 because they use replay gain and it gets different results.
So quick question about that. -14, I think of sort of like the K-meter system and even the K-meter plugin. Does this mean that if we set it for like K14, that we're sort of hitting the right kind of ballpark when our mix is kind of at the 0 meter point, that our mixes are right in the ballpark for proper playback, as far as generally speaking across these different sites?
Roughly speaking, I believe the K system uses the RMS level to judge the loudness. And that's slightly different to the LUFS system. But if you've got a balanced EQ in the mix, you don't have way more bass or way more upper mids or something, they'll give broadly similar results. Also, I think there's not actually a K14 setting. Most of them, I think it's K20, K12.
Right.
But what you could do is you could go for K12 and just keep an eye on, keep the peaks maybe a couple of dBs lower than you would otherwise have done. Right. And then you'll be hitting effectively K14. So yeah, give or take, that's the right ballpark.
I mean, it's an illusion to think that I've got that much control anyway. So as long as I'm ballpark, I know I'm happy and I can start making rock and roll. I do have another question for you though. What if I get a loudness penalty on one site, but not on the other? I mean, like what should we do then?
That's a great question. And that's actually, well, what to do is the really tricky question. This literally happened just a couple of days ago. Somebody asked me in the forum for the Home Mastering Masterclass. They said they had uploaded a song to Spotify and it had come out sounding quieter than they'd expected. So they checked it on loudness penalty and they saw that on Tidal, the level wasn't being changed, right? Which means that the level's about -14. But on Spotify, which is also approximately -14, it was being turned down by 3 dBs. And 3 dBs may not sound like a lot, but actually when you're talking about a final mastered file, that's a really noticeable difference between those two.
Isn't 3 dB supposed to be double the energy? Something like that?
6 dBs is double the I get
loudness.
Confused because there's a difference between loudness and power and current and all the rest of it. But yeah, I mean, it's a significant, it's a very noticeable difference. I mean, most people will notice, I mentioned before, if you play people's stuff that's like a dB different, they may not, they'll probably pick out something different about one of them, but they won't be able to say why.
Right, exactly.
3 dBs, most people go, oh, that one's quieter, and possibly less. So yes, and we looked into it, and what we discovered is that their song had one very loud section. Was quite a bit, the overall level was fairly gentle, and then a big loud section at one point. And what we think is happening is that this is a great example of the difference between the LUFS loudness system and the replay gain loudness system, right? Tidal's using LUFS, Spotify is using replay gain. And replay gain, you only have to have, if you have 6%, or actually 5% is the boundary, but say 6%, slightly more than 5% of the song is really loud, replay gain will decide that the whole song should be labeled as being that loud. Okay. So if you have a quiet song and then you put in a really loud section, so like just say it's 100 seconds long, right? 6 seconds of loud stuff, and replay gain will go, oh, it's that loud, and we'll turn it down by that much. Whereas the LUFS system is more forgiving, if you like, of loud sections. So you can have more of the song louder than the rest of it. And they might kind of increase the loudness level that they measure slightly, but it's not as extreme a change as with replay gain. So that's some really valuable information that the loudness penalty site can give you. Is like, okay, well, so Tidal thinks it's fine, but Spotify's going to turn it down by 3 dBs.
Right.
What you do about that, that's then tricky, right? Because what do? Do you reduce the contrast between the loud and the quiet sections? Do you increase the overall loudness? Do you reduce the overall loudness? And I don't have a great answer to that right yet, but we're working on it.
Well, I think what's cool about that is at least it gives us the choice. You know, it gives us an option to make a decision about what we think sounds good. And again, you can listen to those different levels playing back on the loudnesspenalty.com site. And that's what's so cool about it. You can hear how it plays back through the browser. And, you know, if you get your browser open in your studio and you also have your, you know, system audio or whatever playing out through your studio setup, you could hear it on your studio monitors and make a decision. Or like I said, I could just play the browser off of my iPhone in the car and hear it in that context. So it's very, very real world, user-friendly as far as context, which is super cool. And you can make up your own decisions. And I don't see why you couldn't just, you know, some people might just go, you know what, my favorite place to listen to things is Spotify. So I'm just going to make sure it sounds great there. Or somebody else will say, YouTube is my jam, so I'm going to make sure that it always sounds great on YouTube, and whatever the other ones are, that's just the way it is. And I think that's great. It lets people make their own choice about that stuff. There is a question, though, that I think some people might want to know, which is, and maybe you already answered this, but you want to touch on it again, but, you know, does this mean that we no longer have to make our mixes loud? Do we now I just don't even care because they're just going to turn it up for me? Is it like that?
I would say yes and no. I mean, yeah, overall, I would say the big message about all of this is it's great news because, you know, I said before, my problem with the loudness war is when people do it because they think they need to. You know, there's these ideas that it'll sell more or that it'll be more popular or the people won't like it if it's super loud. And actually, none of that stuff is true. Even without loudness normalization, there's research that shows that stuff doesn't hold up. Mm-hmm. You know, users care about songs, they care about arrangements, they care about vocal performances. You know, does it make them cry? Does it make them want to dance? Loudness doesn't really come into that. So for me to chase the loudness war thing is like, you know, chasing a red herring. I mean, it's just pointless. Mm-hmm. You know, and the great thing about all of this, the new loudness normalization is we can stop worrying about it. It's like, I don't have to worry, am I as loud as X, Y, Z? Just make the music sound great. Having said that, because YouTube and Tidal, for example, don't turn things up, if you choose to make your music quiet and it doesn't get turned up, it might not sound as loud as you would hope in those online scenarios. So no, it's not quite true that you don't have to make the music sound loud at all. Right. And that's another reason for using loudness penalty is to double check. If you see a couple of dashes on the loudness penalty site and you preview it, because, you know, you can compare different tabs, but you could also have YouTube open another tab. So you could, you know, your favorite reference track, you can play it straight off of YouTube, listen to it, flick to the loudness penalty tab and preview your mix or master with the YouTube setting chosen. And you can hear exactly how it will sound when you actually upload it to YouTube. And you can decide whether you're happy with the result or not.
Well, I think
if it comes out a little bit quiet, then you might want to make some changes to fix that, or maybe you're happy with it. You know, it's. But yeah, if you have this one thing, I mean, you mentioned the fact that YouTube is a video site, and you're absolutely right. One thing that I do see is things that have come from broadcast. So YouTube's standard is roughly say minus 14 for simplicity. But the broadcast standard is minus 23. So that's another 9 dBs lower. So some people have uploaded, obviously, videos from the video master that was supplied for broadcast, 9 dBs quieter. YouTube hasn't turned it up. And those ones, you do hear a difference. So
makes sense.
You know, the great news is that the levels they chose match that musical sweet spot. It's not then, you know, there's not a technical thing that we're talking about. If your stuff's in the right ballpark for the streaming services, you've got every chance of making it sound great as well. But you do need to have it loud enough. Yeah. That's also important.
One of the things that I know I have experienced myself in the studio that is very frustrating, and I never really liked it, was mixing. You know, I think when you begin mixing, you begin to learn, okay, I need to make sure that I'm not over, you know, pushing the two mix too hard and getting overs and crunching things and stuff like that. So you begin to, you inevitably do that in the beginning, and then you I start doing tricks like, all right, well, while I'm working, why don't I just start out with the volume knob turned up higher in the studio so that it still rocks to me when I want it to, but I know I've got a little more headroom in there because I'm not pushing it as hard on my 2 mix. And then I'll start learning how to mix with the volume knob just simply turned up more so that there's a little more room to breathe, But then inevitably, then I start discovering that my mixes maybe aren't as loud as I wanted them to be by the time they were done, because you hear something that's, been mastered or whatever. And so I would find myself going, okay, now I got to turn the volume way down and start really pushing stuff so that it's, so that it's really more compressed and more excited. Or I hear a story about, Chris Lord-Alge mixing at really low levels and, that forcing you to try and make things more exciting. But then, and I know I'm going in circles here, but then that overexcited, over compressed, over loud version would, in the final scenario where I'm just rocking it out in the car, I might discover that I didn't really like the way that turned out, and that I like the one, where I started so much better when it was sort of a simple rough mix, or it was just like, I was just able to turn the speakers up. So I just think it's cool that we, instead of this guessing game of, well, I'll just turn my speakers way down and just turn up all the gain and the levels so that it sounds loud again, because that's what you're supposed to do, and that's what everybody does, that you can have a tool like loudnesspenalty.com to actually give you some meaningful numbers and make sure you're in the right ballpark. You still want to crank it so you can trust your ears, but at least you have a target that's meaningful. Because we didn't used to have a target, man. We literally was just like, how loud can you make it,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's and that was the goal, right? Was because, the reason we made the site was that it was getting to the point where literally every day, people knew that streaming sites were changing loudness. And they kept emailing and messaging on Facebook. And it's like, well, how loud should I make stuff? And that's the question that the site, because I can't tell you, right? Because I don't know what, if it's a gentle folk song, then the answer to that is probably different than if it's a full-on metal song or if it's an EDM tune or whatever. And also, I can't tell you what your taste is. Some people like really dense, compressed mixes. Some people like stuff that's more open and spacious. The great thing about the website is you can answer those questions yourself, because, you can now know what is going to happen when the stuff is uploaded. So you're hearing it kind of as it will be heard in the final analysis, right? Mm-hmm. It's a real world context, so people can make up their own minds.
Well, I think it's cool. And Rockstars, I really want to encourage you to go check this out and try it. Loudnesspenalty.com. Go take any of your music right now. Upload a mix to one
Except
tab.
It doesn't upload.
Oh, excuse me. Don't upload. Thank you for pointing that out.
You just drag it in. It gets processed in your browser.
Yeah. Just listen back in one tab to your original mix, and then listen back in another tab to, a louder version of your mix, and get familiar with how they, when they're level matched, how you might start noticing that one sounds better than the other. And you're going to be surprised that you won't need to squash everything in order to get it to sound great to your ear, and then the other thing I want to point out too is that's the beauty of it, is having some target numbers to start feeling more confident about that you're doing things right. 2 is being able to trust your ear so that you can actually hear these differences and start realizing and understanding what this whole conversation is about. When people like Ian are reminding us that, making things louder at the mix and master stage doesn't necessarily translate to sounding better at the final listening stage. But also just be aware, even for me, it took me a minute to really begin to understand this stuff. And Ian's been kind and generous to build these tools for us and take time out to really educate us and educate me as well. And when you go to the site, you can check your music, and you don't have to do anything except just check it and try it out. But there is an option for you to opt in and include your email address too, so that you can get specific numbers sent back to your email. And I believe, Ian, you also will share like teaching and explainer emails that really can kind of let you absorb this stuff. So in other words, you can go and get the job done that you need right now, but definitely go sign up, Rockstars, because you're going to get emails that will help you understand what these things mean and how they're changing. And it allows Ian to keep you in the loop with this stuff so that you really begin to understand how it works and how you can make sure that your mixes are sounding great on all online streaming sites. What are some of the other, anything else you want to mention about the site that we forgot to touch on, or about, joining the email list?
No, I think that's great. That's a great point. I'd forgotten to mention that. Yeah, there's a 5-part little mini e-course. We just send you 5 short emails, kind of getting you up to speed on all of this stuff. And we're going to be adding to that in the future. In the meantime, I'm happy to answer questions if people want to message me on Facebook or Twitter or wherever.
Oh, that's great.
Because we want to help. The whole idea of the site is to help people, right? Is so they can get better results with their music. And part of that is we understand that it's, especially if you haven't come across this stuff before, it can be difficult to get your head around. So, we want to help people figure their way through it. And yeah, we're going to be doing more educational stuff as time goes on.
Well, super cool. Now, Rockstars, the next thing I want to talk about too is that Ian also has a couple of other wonderful tools that can really help you out. Now, for me, a first thought was like, okay, this is wonderful. I love hitting these targets. But are there any helpful tools that will sort of let me in real time while I'm mixing get a better understanding of whether I'm doing the right stuff while I'm working? And so, Ian, I wondered if you could introduce us to both Perception and Dynameter and let the Rockstars know how these tools are really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before I do, we've both been talking a lot about targets. I don't actually suggest that people aim for these levels, right? Because you want to do what's right for the music. At the end of the day, all this stuff is just numbers. So like I said, if I see something being turned down by 6 dBs everywhere, that feels like a wasted opportunity to me. I want to do the experiment and see how it comes out. But if you like the -6 result, then that's the version for you. Yeah.
Right.
So, and I mean, this is an interesting point. If you imagine, I mentioned, kind of an acoustic ballad versus a heavy metal tune, right? It wouldn't make any sense to master both of those at the same loudness, because an acoustic vocal probably isn't meant to be as loud as a full-on metal tune. You want to do what's musically right for those songs.
I don't know. Have you heard some of the acoustic vocal stuff coming out of Nashville?
Okay, so there's a discussion there we could have about taste, but it's all of this stuff is for information only, right? I guess what I would encourage people to do is to do what is right for the music, and then check it using these sites. And if you find that the numbers are kind of telling you something weird or it sounds strange to you, then you can take steps to fix those problems. If everything sounds great to you, then you're good to go, and you don't need to do anything else. And there's one link that we maybe could offer the Rockstars that they would find helpful, because people are always asking me this whole thing about how loud. There's a blog post where I explain my own personal process for deciding how loud to make stuff. It's productionadvice.co.uk/how-loud. It's really simple. And you follow those guidelines, 9 times out of 10, you're bang in the sweet spot for the online streaming services. I just wanted to mention that. In terms of the plugins, so in a nutshell, Perception is like being able to check your songs in different browser tabs, but in your DAW. Okay, so you can you put it on the stereo output of your DAW. You put another instance of it at the beginning of your processing chain, and it measures the difference in loudness before and after all of your processing. It's typically a mastering tool at the moment.
Well, I might just put it on my mix bus, because you can. If I'm really trying to process stuff in the mix bus, I might want to make sure that my processing is making things sound better, not making it sound worse.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's also going to be helpful, especially if people use the kind of the top-down mixing approach. If you have a bus compressor on the output, anywhere where you are using processing and want to hear the difference, because we've been talking about this all the time. If you do something to your mix that makes it 3 dBs louder, and you try comparing it without correcting for that loudness difference, chances are the louder version is going to sound better to you.
Right.
One of the problems with loudness is that it kind of overwhelms any other changes. If you increase the loudness by a dB or two, that change, our ear is so sensitive to that loads of other subtleties that might have been there can get kind of swamped by that difference in loudness.
Let me jump in for a sec and qualify that a little bit more, clarify that. So Rockstars, let's just come right out and say it. We are putting all kinds of shit on our stereo bus if we want to, especially when you discover the new plugin and it sounds so cool and this sounds exciting, whatever, you put all that stuff on there. And then what happens more often than not is you've got all this stuff on there and you're like, I wonder if it's making things better. And you hit bypass on all the plugins, and then you hear your original mix, and your original mix sounds darker, sounds a little bit more like it has a blanket on. It's quiet, and you immediately go, oh, it sounds way better now. But the problem is, in order to really do a comparison, you should be turning up the speaker volume of your original mix to hear it at that volume, and then like very quickly turning your speaker volume down and then enabling all the plugins so that you're matching the volume levels. But obviously, just hearing my description, that's pretty insane. Like, you can't even do all those buttons all at once to do a quick comparison. So take it away, Ian. Explain how perception actually allows us to do that.
Well, it basically does that automatically with one click. So, you get your song sounding the way that you like it with all of those plugins on your mix bus. I don't particularly recommend that approach, but I know I've done it myself. We've all done it. So then you give perception, say 5-10 seconds of time to figure out the differences in loudness, and then you hit the balance button, and it matches the before and after loudness, and then it has its own bypass button. So you click bypass, and it basically disables the entire effects chain effectively. It doesn't actually disable the plugins, but that's the effect when you hear it.
Yeah, but no matter what plugins you've decided to use from whichever plugin manufacturer, it doesn't matter. It's able to sort of bypass all of them
exactly. And even if you have an external hardware chain, so you could route the stuff out through a ton of analog gear and bring it back in.
Oh, cool.
It compensates for the sync. So you get a seamless transition. So you can hit bypass and you hear it without that difference in loudness. So you can make a really fair comparison, right? So you're not fooled by, I call it the loudness deception, right? The changes that you've made are not swamped by that difference in loudness. You hear the before and after at the same loudness, and you can really say, yeah, I still like everything that I did, or, oh, I like it, but maybe that piano's just crunching up a little bit, or maybe, that bass isn't singing out quite the way that it used to, it doesn't have quite that space. Or you might kind of go, oh, I mean, this happens to me all the time. You mastering a song, I work on it for half an hour. It's like, yeah, this sounds awesome. I plug in perception and I go, yeah, maybe not. Maybe I need to think about that again. Because, we all get carried away. What's the thing? I've never met an effect I didn't like a lot of. That's not my quote. That's
pretty accurate, though.
Yeah, absolutely. We've all been there. So perception is like being able to, instead of having to, if we go back to the loudness penalty site, you can use loudness penalty for free. So you export the softer version or the raw mix, whatever it is you're interested in comparing, and then you export the louder version. You drag them both in. You have them in separate tabs. You flip between them. You compare them. You hear them loudness match, and you can decide which one you like. If you're not happy, you go back and you change it, and then you re-export them and do them again. I mean, it works, and it's better than not being able to do it at all. But it's not as bad as having to adjust the volume level as you described, but it's still a ton of work, right? With perception, you've got it right there in the DAW, 2 clicks, and you can just instantly make those decisions.
So cool.
It is. It's very cool. I mean, it constantly amazes me how cool it is. And I'm not saying that a big-headed way, right? What I mean is, I came up with the idea. I worked with it, with Ian on it to come up with it, and it's just insanely useful. It's like having a magnifying glass for the mix or something. All of these details, loudness matching is incredibly powerful. And it just astonishes me how what it enables you to hear.
Well, it's pretty amazing when you first discover this and you really hear the loudness matched, the A/B comparisons, and you begin to realize, wow, this, when I push this limiter harder and I thought it was sounding better, now with something like perception, I can actually hear it sounding worse. So that's pretty cool. Now tell us about Dynameter too, because that's a really fun tool to have. I use it all the time now. Every mix and master I do more mixing than mastering, but I always just pop that right on the end of my tube mix bus, and I've just got this wonderful, colorful display. Rockstars, I've said it before with Ian, but it reminds me of having my Atari 2600 again, and I'm playing Yar's Revenge, and I've got like this, these amazing colors all up on the screen the whole time I'm working. But introduce us to Dynameter and what is the tool? Why do we need it? And how is it useful?
So we've talked several times already about, this idea that the more you push the loudness up, the less space you've got between 0 dB full scale. And, so if you imagine the trampoline being lifted up towards the ceiling, right? Eventually you have to start ducking your head and then crunching up in a ball and, banging up against the ceiling. Same thing happens with the music. And it's literally like that. There's less and less space for the music to move the more you push it up. And Dynameter gives you a visual representation of how much space there is. So basically, because you can figure out how much space there is by keeping an eye on where the peaks are and where your loudness is and kind of going, okay, so I've got that. And, you can kind of figure it out. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's much more intuitive to see that represented directly. So basically, if you push the loudness really high, so that there's not enough space for the music to do its thing in, the display on Dynameter gets really crushed and narrow. So it's like a bar that expands and contracts. So for dynamic stuff, the bar is big and wide because there's plenty of space for it to work. And as the music gets squashed into closer and closer to the ceiling, the bar gets smaller and smaller. But it also kind of leaves a trace over time. It's like a waterfall. Okay, so you can see the history of what's happened as your song plays. So you can see where the really loud chorus is because the graph gets really narrow, and you can see where the kind of the open spacious verse is because it gets wider again. And it's also color coded. So we've designed it so that we've been talking about the sweet spot all the way through this conversation. If you're in the sweet spot in Dynameter in terms of mastering, then you're going to be seeing lots of green, some yellow, maybe some orange, and maybe the occasional bit of red at the really loud, intense parts. Yeah. I like to see the meters just kissing the red. So that's what we did with Dynameter as well. If you push it too far, if you push it further, it kind of starts to go a dark kind of brown color and eventually a kind of gray color.
It's like your mix. When your mix sounds like poop, it looks like poop.
I have to say that is why we chose those colors. Interesting, because you were talking about Bob Katz earlier on, demonstrating the effects of the loudness wars. With the kind of the waveforms, kind of being small and spiky, and then getting bigger and spiky, and then starting to get kind of big and squared off as the loudness wars came into effect. One of our users did something similar with Dynameter, where he took the songs by the Rolling Stones over the years, over whatever it is, 20, 30 years that they've been releasing music, and measured them with Dynameter, and he's put them all in a grid. I'm hoping to get his permission to put it in a blog post on the site, because you can see, back in the day, the Dynameter curves look fantastic. They're all colorful and there's loads of variety in them. And over the years, they just gradually get squashed and squashed and squashed until literally the last few are kind of like this little piece of kind of gray string running down the middle of the display. It's kind of tragic to just see, all of that, the space just gets sucked out of it or crushed out of the music. Yeah. So that's what the meter is. The other thing that it does is it gives you some guidelines. There are some presets in there that you can choose. So you can say, okay, I want, if you're mixing, there's a preset you can choose. If there's an aggressive or a kind of a limited setting, if you want to really push things to the maximum of where I would suggest you do. And you just keep an eye on where the graph is in terms of those guidelines. And it's a quick and easy way to, to keep your ears in check, because we all get, your ears get tired, or you just kind of lose a bit of perspective on what you're working on. It's like any other kind of meter. It's just a visual aid that helps you kind of go, is what I'm hearing really good? And then the other thing that it can do is just offer you guidelines for each of the streaming services. So, as I say, you can go through that whole process with loudnesspenalty.com of export, drag it in, process, test, listen, compare, and all the rest of it. For me, when I'm mastering, I use a couple of different loudness meters, but I always have Dynameter there like you said. And I know that if it sounds good to me and the graph looks a certain way, when I test it on loudnesspenalty.com, I'm going to be happy with the numbers.
So cool.
It's basically so you could, it gives you confidence as you work that you're going to get a great result in the end. I mean, I guess occasionally you might get something that surprises you and think, oh man, am I not quite happy with that? And you might want to revise it. But since we developed the loudness penalty site, Dynameter we released it in 2015. I've been using it on every master I do ever since. Once we did the loudness penalties, only a couple of months old. And of course, one of the things I've been doing is kind of just looking through the archives on my hard drive and kind of, I wonder what happens when I drop this in or this in. And over again, I just see loudness penalty results that I'm completely comfortable with,
Yeah, that's cool.
And that's the goal is to be able to stop worrying about all this stuff,
Yeah.
Because loudness is this red herring. It's like what we care about is, what does the music sound like? Does it move us? That's all the important stuff. Is the arrangement working? Does the guitar solo sing out the way that we like? Forget all the numbers and all the rest of it. So it's just a kind of shortcut to getting the results that you want.
Well, in my experience, when I'm mixing with Dynameter on, is there's a tendency working on a mix, especially if it's sort of rock stuff, or I'm trying to make it loud or competitive or whatever. There's a tendency to even as I'm spending a longer and longer time on a song, to just keep pushing it and kind of overcook it and start to get to places where things are just too squashed or starting to sound harsh and mid-rangey and stuff like that. And sure enough, when I go look at Dynameter, if I'm starting to get into, the poop colors, I'm also hitting that zone where I'm not liking my mix. And it gives me this great, easy, colorful, it's like a real positive feeling if I'm going to stare at a screen, it might as well look good while I'm staring at it, And it gives me that ability to just kind of like bring things back a little bit and get the colors back to where I like them. And sure enough, every time, my mix sounds better. So it's a really, really cool tool. Rockstars, I highly recommend you go check it out. Again, these may all be new concepts to you. And fortunately, Ian has got tons of videos, got a great simple 5-email course on loudnesspenalty.com to help you understand how to use this stuff. But the beauty is, in the meantime, immediately you can just simply upload stuff to loudnesspenalty.com, see what the results look like, listen to the differences, try a couple of levels on your own until you start saying like, oh, I kind of like where this is, and then be confident that you're kind of hitting it right. So Ian, we've been going for quite a while. Let me just ask you a couple of questions from the jam session, and then we'll kind of jump out here. Are there any, recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something about kind of mixing and getting things to hit right in this ballpark that you want to share? I mean, maybe we've talked about them all, but if there's anything else for the rock stars when they're doing their next mix about just kind of, hitting the right ballpark, maybe you can recap that.
I think probably the most important one is, you were talking about monitor levels earlier on, and you said that you were cranking the monitor gain up when you were mixing. I think that's a fantastic thing to do. And I would add to that, I think using reference tracks is one of the keys to, if you want your music to sound like your favorite songs, you need to compare it to your favorite songs.
Yeah.
But you need to do it loudness matched, right? If you bring in a master that is 6 dBs or more louder than the mix that you're working on, you're going to be immediately depressed with the way that your mix sounds, just because that master is so much louder. So, if you've got your volume up when you're mixing, so you don't have to worry about crushing the two bus, exactly like you were talking about, it's sounding great to you, and you think, okay, I need to check it against my reference material. Bring that reference track in and turn it down till it sounds the same level as what you're working on. Because then you're going to get a fair comparison. If you have perception, of course, you can use that to do it for you automatically, but you can do it by ear, or you can measure it using a loudness meter. You could use loudness penalty, right? You could drag both files onto loudness penalty, compare them that way. But whatever method you use, take loudness out of the equation. It is still important. The stuff still has to be loud enough, and you don't want it to be too loud. So I'm not going to say it doesn't matter at all, but take care of all that other stuff first, do all the musical stuff. And the key to that is having your monitor gain set right, and loudness matching.
Yeah, super cool. Okay. So now let's talk about a favorite hardware tool. And I thought maybe on this one, maybe we could remind the rock stars about the value of a simple SPL meter, which sometimes you see those around, but maybe not as much as you used to. I don't know.
Right. So SPL is sound pressure level meter. You used to be able to buy them from, I guess in the US, it would have been Radio Shack. And over here, it would have been, I forget the name of the chain. I think both of those have stopped trading now. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But I mean, the good news is you can get apps for phones. Now, the mic on a phone is not going to be as good as a dedicated hardware mic, but you could still use that to get an idea of how loud you're monitoring. Yeah. And one thing, I think, so one of the most important things that I suggest to people who do the mastering course that I do is, or one of the first things I teach is to use a consistent monitoring level when you're mastering. When you're mixing, you need to adjust the volume control so that it sounds loud enough to you, and then you can get it right. When you come to mastering, you want to be balancing songs against each other to get the levels right. And stage one is to find a monitoring level that's comfortable for you and play everything at the same level on there so that you can compare things fairly. It comes back to loudness matching again. And using, an SPL meter, either a hardware one that you buy or an app on your phone, you can actually, there's a pink noise file on one of the blog posts on my website, which we could put in the show notes for people so that they could head over and take a listen. And there's some guidelines in that blog post as well as to how to use it. You can use that to measure the loudness of your monitoring. And it's a personal thing. So I would always say set the monitoring level so that you're comfortable. Mm-hmm. If you're kind of constantly wanting to push up the faders in the DAW to get the level right, then your monitoring level is probably quite too quiet. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you find that your ears start to get tired, or you get ringing in your ears, or you're just kind of, getting a headache or whatever, then probably the monitoring level is too high. But having said all of that, round about 80 dB for the playback level of the pink noise file is probably pretty good for either mixing or mastering. And certainly, one thing is you've got to protect your hearing. So if you're monitoring significantly louder than that for long periods of time, then you really want to start thinking about changing that practice, right? Because the legal levels are much higher, but they're based on people working in industry, right? With ear defense and all the rest of it. Right. But we're just listening to music.
If you're listening to music for hours and hours, your hearing changes. You're gonna wear yourself out. And I think the body's, even a mental defense is to just start ignoring what's coming in your ears. It's like, so that's why finding the sweet spot. And again, I'd heard that before, 80, 85 decibels or whatever is a good, middle ballpark zone to start paying attention to, how does stuff sound playing back at that level in your studio. And that's a good place to start. Well, that's very cool. So now software tool would be a next question. And of course, I think we just want to mention all three again. Rockstars, go to loudnesspenalty.com. Also go to Meter Plugs and check out Perception and Dynameter, both coming from Ian, and even K-Meter, which is another plugin from you guys or from Ian's site, as just really useful tools for starting to be able to mix and do all that. Anything else you want to recommend too, Ian?
I'm a huge fan of another kind of meter, which is the VU meter. It's the old kind of needle meters that you used to have, and that's what I was trained with. So there were no LUFS meters back in those days. Even RMS meters back then were a new thing. I actually don't have a hardware VU meter anymore, but I do have a plug-in emulation. So if you want possibly the most affordable loudness meter, then there's one made by a company called Klanghelm. It's the VUMT, which I think stands for VU meter, but it's the VUMPT, right? So it's the Klanghelm VUMPT. And personally, I feel like, how could you not want to use a plugin that's called the Klanghelm VUMPT?
I love it.
It's there's some posts on my site that will kind of tell you how I use that if people are interested.
Is it true that it even uses the improbability drive from from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as its meter engine?
It's absolutely true, yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, a little sideline reference there, rock stars. Ian and I are both big fans of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But
Powered by a nice cup of hot tea.
Indeed. All right, awesome, dude. Moving forward, one last question. This is hypothetical. We'll take the Wayback Studio machine, the Wayback Loudness machine, and I imagine you could go back to earlier on when you were mixing and mastering music and find yourself and give yourself one bit of advice and say, maybe relative to this topic today, what would you tell yourself was the single most important thing to being a rock star of the recording studio yourself, and making records that really play back great in the studio as a finished product?
This is going to sound too convenient, but it is true. I would tell myself, don't worry about the loudness war, because I was a mastering engineer coming up when all of this was happening. I was there looking at these new albums coming out going, I can't believe they made it that loud. How did they make it that loud? Why did they make it? And there came a point, and it was around about 2000, where I just got to the point where I was like, if I'm just going to compete in this competition, I would have to do stuff that I was uncomfortable with to the music. And I just drew my own personal line in the sand. But prior to that, I'd been agonizing about it, just like everybody else. I'd been feeling that pressure. I'd been feeling that competition. And I'm so glad that I didn't kind of follow the herd, if you like. I've got a Spotify playlist somewhere with kind of examples of stuff that I've mastered over the whole of my career. And it's pretty consistent, and I'm really happy about that. So, I would just go back and say, look, just chill.
Which is, translation. It's also kind of saying, just trust your ears. And I find it's nice when you can go back and listen to stuff that you've done previously or years ago, whatever, and discover that your ears had some pretty good ideas back then too, and not be caught up in, only what happens today is good and what happened previously wasn't good because I didn't know all the same things, or I didn't make everything loud enough or whatever. So that's good, man. That's exactly. Good encouragement. Ian, thank you so much for joining us again on the show, man. It's super awesome to just hang out with you. Of course, Rockstars, in full transparency, I enjoy talking to Ian all the time if I can. So we're old friends at this point, from the first episode to now, which is awesome. But tell the Rockstars again, where should they go? How can they find out more about you? Tell them where to go.
Oh, thanks, Lidge. So the main website is productionadvice.co.uk. There's a Facebook page, Production Advice, or you can search for Ian Shepherd. You can Google me. I'm at Ian Shepherd, PHERD on Twitter. I'm fairly easy to find these days.
Okay, groovy. And then, of course, go to loudnesspenalty.com and start using it now and check your mixes there, and you're going to have a good time. And make sure you sign up for the 5-email mini course, too, so that you can learn more about this stuff, because there's a lot of cool stuff to really get to understand with this. So, Ian, thanks, man. It's an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to hang again. I don't know which conference we're going to meet at again in the future, when you come across the pond or I go over there, but looking forward to it, dude.
No, thanks, Lidge. Look forward to it, yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for staying up late. Rockstars, it's bedtime for Ian across the water there compared to here.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
All right, man. Cheers. We'll see you soon.
Cheers, Lidge.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lidge Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.